back, everyone, to the Light and Life podcast, conversations on faith and life in downtown Colorado Springs. I'm your host, Liza, today with a special guest, Parker Samelson. He's the Assistant Director of the Young Adults. Welcome, Parker.
So happy to be here. It's an honor to be part of this podcast. I actually was born and raised going to First Presbyterian Church and have been working here with the young adults for the last few months and have had an absolute blast. And so I'm excited to be on the podcast.
Can you tell me a little bit about what it was like to grow up here?
Yeah.
In this church?
Yeah, well, when I came here as a kid, the pastor was Dr. Stevens, who I believe was the head pastor here for maybe 30 years or so, which is pretty inspirational. For me, just kind of starting out in my career as a young person, it's pretty inspiring to see that dedication over decades and decades. It reminds me of the Eugene Peterson quote, where sometimes the Christian faith is just a long obedience in the same direction. And we had a great experience growing up here. And the guy who was the high school director when I was here had a huge impact on my life as well. And I just decided to come back here after graduating from college.
Well, that's awesome. We're so glad you're here. Thank you for being here with us. Speaking of, your youth, today we're actually talking about different generations and their approach to Christianity, specifically among Gen Z and baby boomers, and how they can learn from each other. So what inspired this topic for you?
Yeah, well, I was interested in talking about this podcast or this topic on this episode here today. And I think the reason why is I think there's a lot of even like fear around this topic where I think even parents in the Christian community are fearful of what's happening with the younger generation, where there's different big generational categories that a lot of the polling organizations will use. But yeah, I mean, say you compare just baby boomers to Gen Z. I mean, there's some pretty majorly significant differences in just the approach to Christianity, faith, and just overall values that are important. And I think it's definitely worth diving into. It's a really pertinent topic to both parents and young people who are growing up in this modern world and trying to discover what their faith means for them.
Mm-hmm. So where do you fall in that? Are you a Gen Z?
Yeah, so my wife and I debate about this a lot because there's some different definitions, but the most broad definitions of these different categories, I'm the last year of millennial.
Okay.
So I'm curious where you are, so I was born in 95, so most people say 96 is the cutoff.
Okay.
So 96 is kind of starting Gen Z. And the research I've done is there's two things that really could pin somebody as a Gen Z. Besides post-1996, the other two are, one, you don't remember 9/11.
Oh, I heard that.
Yeah. And then the other one is that you grew up with smartphones at like kind of early to mid high school, which I feel like it makes a big difference.
What if your parents hated you and gave you I'm
just
joking sarcastically. If you had a little Firefly phone, even though iPhones were out.
Yeah, right.
I had a 4-button little Firefly phone that was for emergencies only, but I found a way to change the numbers on the 4 different buttons.
Oh, you hacked it.
So it was like my grandma, my mom's best friend, my mom, and my dad.
Okay.
And I would take off like my mom's best friend and put in my friend's phone number, or take off my grandma, and then I'd get in trouble because my mom would find out later.
Yeah.
But I am a Gen Z through and through. Yes. Well, I don't know why I'd get offended when people told me that I was a Gen Z.
Right.
I was in Gen Z, but I've always been told that I was on the cusp of millennial and Gen Z, and I always thought millennials were like so much cooler than Gen Z.
Yeah.
And now I've really acknowledged and taken charge of my Gen Z roots. Yes.
Fair.
So what would you say the main differences are, not just in Christianity, but in terms of like habits and behaviors?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing I did want to do in approaching this topic is I think it's easy to just over caricature young people in Gen Z. And I think young people can be really frustrated by that, where oftentimes just the way that young people in Gen Z are caricatured and lampooned in the media and stuff like that. It's like, okay, this isn't fair. Where even just working with Floyd at the church here who runs the fellows program, I mean, even just the different fellows groups, and I'd be curious to hear your perspective on this, like the different fellows groups that he's had go through that are mostly all Gen Z. I'm like, these people are awesome. Like these people give me a lot of faith in the future. And, you know, something I was reflecting on recently is even just reading Ecclesiastes. Even in Ecclesiastes, it talks about how it's like, oh, the older generation is always frustrated by the younger generation, and there's all this fear. So it's like, okay, clearly this isn't a new thing. Like this is a recurring cycle where even the baby boomers, I mean, the older generation was looking at them and be like, look at these hippies all going to Woodstock and they're crazy and they're going to ruin the country. And now they're doing the same thing to us. And I'm sure we'll do the same thing when we're old people. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, and I think one thing that I have found helpful is I really do think there's things that both generations could kind of learn from each other. Where, for example, if we're kind of diving into this here, I think there's different characteristics that some could say are overgeneralizations, but other people would say, no, this is fair. Like this generally is a fair characteristic that that defines these different generations. So for baby boomers, what's true about baby boomers that maybe isn't as true about Gen Z? A strong work ethic, traditionalism, and loyalty. So, or even just like patriotism, you know?
Right
like
on.
the baby boomers, they're like, yeah, my dad fought on Normandy. Like I think there's just a patriotism and like an appreciation for like traditional American values. Whereas I think with Gen Z, the almost cliche term at this point is like deconstruction, right? Where Gen Z are like, wait, okay, so all my boomer parents, kind of tried to infuse all of these different traditional values in who I am growing up. But there's kind of a questioning of like, wait, like, is being patriotic even something worth doing? Like that doesn't even, like, maybe that's not even biblical. Like maybe like Christian nationalism isn't even something that I should aspire to. Maybe I should critique my country more. Or so I think, and there's things like that I think baby boomers are frustrated by, where they're like, okay, these young people are just trying to poke holes in everything, and they don't even have any values that they're embracing. And so it's kind of, it can be hard, where I think there's some things that young people have a good point, where it's like, okay, no generation is perfect. So it's like, obviously there's things that are valid critiques, but it's like, you kind of really have to have discernment and like a biblical foundation to be able to kind of see all these different things and say which of these things are actually worth embracing and which of them aren't. So
right.
Yeah.
And I think it's funny that you mentioned, you know, older generations being frustrated with the younger generations and vice versa. There was actually this pretty viral trend recently, maybe in the past 2 years, where younger generations, just to, you know, kind of dig at other people's content on social media, such as TikTok or Instagram. If they say something that's controversial, a younger generation would just say, okay, boomer.
Right, yeah.
And that would even happen within like Gen Z to Gen Z. They would almost try to be offensive to another Gen Zer by calling them a boomer based on their thoughts or beliefs, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So how do you suggest that we come together despite our differences? Not that there's some, huge device between the generations, but there are differences in how we approach the world just from like perspectives. I feel like, at least in my experience, a lot of older generations behave, think, do, even their purchasing decisions are all passed down from generations prior, and they've all been taught behaviors. Whereas I feel like younger generations have this like rebellious mindset of like, no, I want to think for my own self. Like, don't put me in a box. Don't, tell me how I should think, live.
Yeah.
It's almost like everyone's getting offended and nobody knows why anyone's offended, but we're trying
right.
to find reasons to be offended.
Right.
I don't know. So what is your suggestion? How should Christians approach each other in their generational differences?
Yeah. Well, one thing that comes to mind is there's a ministry in town here in Colorado Springs that I'm going to shout out on the podcast here. It's called Axis.
Okay.
So
how do you spell that?
AXIS.
Great.
So yeah, they started here and they leased some space from Focus on the Family for a while, and now they have a new space in Old Colorado City. But they what they try to do, they have a couple different aspects of their ministry, but one thing that they have is called the culture translator, where they're helping parents be able to like understand some of these crazy things happening with their kids. Yeah, it's kind of funny. Where it's like, okay, there's this new crazy thing that's trending on YouTube or whatever that your kids know about, and they're all talking about it, but you have no idea what it is. But you want to be like discipling your children, and you want to be, you want to be relevant in a way, and without, bending on your own values. But it's like having an understanding of how to kind of have those conversations, I think, can be hard.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think it's just a matter of being like an empathetic listener, of just really trying to like understand.
Mm-hmm.
Where, I think about when I sit down with my grandma, who's 85 years old, every time I sit down with her, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is such an opportunity to be able to talk to my grandma, because she has this rich, like bank of experiences in her life and perspective from, I think of when she was a teenager, World War II was happening, and she knew all of these people that were alive like 90 years before that. So it's like, oh my gosh, like this person here, has so much wisdom that I can benefit from, where I think that's lost, where even it can be difficult even within a church setting to kind of have those intergenerational conversations. Mm-hmm. Like even the young adults group we do, people typically kind of just show up, go upstairs and hang out with other young adults and then leave, where it's like, okay, even just going up and down the elevator, you're in the same elevator as this person who is like a World War II veteran. And it's like, man, how can we have more like rich dialogue and conversations, whereas that same person could probably benefit by, talking to like a super high energy young person who has unique perspectives on life that they've gathered through, again, like just a unique perspective. So I don't know. And I think about how all the different teachings of Jesus, there's different aspects of it that each generation has a really good perspective on, where it's like kind of when you overlay all of them on top of each other is kind of when you get the full big picture. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I feel like it's hard to do that, but I think it's something everyone could aspire to.
So with that, I kind of want to throw out some statistics that we found together in the differences between current practices among the generations. So first, let's start with baby boomers. 76% of baby boomers identify as Christian, and 49% attend religious services at least once a month. But then we go over to Gen Z, and only 49% of Gen Z identify as Christian, whereas 28% of Gen Z attend religious services at least once a month. I'd say that's a pretty big gap.
That's pretty bad.
Yeah.
That's pretty serious, where it's like, again, going back to Ecclesiastes saying even back then, the older generation is kind of complaining about the younger generation. Even though it is kind of true with every generation, you look at something like this and you're like, okay, maybe this is unique, because this is pretty bad. Where again, even just identifying as a Christian. So baby boomers, 76%, but for Gen Z, 49. Let's see here, 49%. So that's under half. I would assume, because of the overall trend that it's going down, down, down every generation, I would assume Gen Z is probably the first generation in American history that's under half, which I'm like, okay, red flag, alarm bells, where it does kind of bring up the question of why. And I think there's a lot of different reasons. I think, again, even just with technology, and people have access to so many different. Well, I think one thing that's definitely true about our generation is kind of just like decision fatigue and perspective fatigue, where my favorite study on this that I heard, and I almost laughed. I was like, man, that is so illustrative of like my generation, is, okay, so there's a study done where they went to a big event. It was a marathon, I think. And they had 3 different tables set up. Okay, so one table, they were passing out granola bars. Like one table had 1 granola bar option, one had like 50 granola bar options, and one had 3 granola bar options. Okay, so and they would poll everybody afterwards, like, hey, how happy were you with your choice? The people that only had one option were like, I'm not very happy. I only had one choice, so I wish I had choices. The 3 people were like, oh, I'm perfect. I had 3 options, and I chose this one, and it was great. The 50 choice people, they were like, I'm so stressed. I'm so overwhelmed.
They have to choose one or the other?
They're like,
oh, that's surprising.
Yeah, they're like, these 50 choices, I'm so overwhelmed and stressed.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like, again, you go into the grocery store and there's like 100 choices for Cheerios. You're like, I'm so overstimulated and stressed. Where I feel like our generation, with all of the different resources at our disposal, there's so many different perspectives and there's so many different options of which paths of life you can go down that it's so stressful and it's so like crippling with the anxiety of having to choose. So again, even like that Gen Z person who's on TikTok and hearing all of these crazy different perspectives, it reminds me of the Bible verse where Jesus is saying, it's like, okay, there's all of these loud voices in the society that you're going to hear, but mine is this like still small voice that it's like my sheep will know me and they'll know my voice. But it's like, I feel like that's getting increasingly difficult where there's just so many options, choices, voices where it's so hard to be able to kind of cut through it and hear the truth.
That's, that just sparked something in me. I had a conversation with my boss today, actually, where since I work in sales, 2 things actually. I'm not supposed to give people multiple options because they have
that makes sense.
Fatigue. Like I'm supposed to give them one option.
Right.
This is what I'm selling you.
Yeah.
But I like to give options because I like them to know the pros and cons of everything. So I'm learning. That's one thing. The other thing is on the internal side, we get thrown a lot of different initiatives or a lot of different things that we need to sell at once.
Yeah.
And I will let that consume and overwhelm me. And what my boss said to me was like, use these as tools to help you do what's best for the client. And I think when it comes to options and beliefs and denominations, all of these different small nuanced things within Christianity that is actually differing of opinions and experiences. I think all of those things can actually be tools for like some sort of building block of faith for people to conquer and learn and build some sort of curiosity. Good point. Another thing I wanted to bring up though with this is that when you see Gen Z's decline in percentage of people in the U.S. at least that identify as a Christian, what I've noticed in my direct sphere of influence, and I'd like to hear what you've noticed, is I think growing up, the assumption was that everyone was a Christian. I think just based on how I grew up, I just assumed everyone was a Christian until I was told otherwise.
Right.
And as I've gotten older, it's turned into, I can't assume until someone brings it up, like especially in the workplace or, where you got to be careful around HR and all that. But you don't assume that they are until they tell you. And then it's disarming.
Totally.
I don't know what your experience is around that, but what I can say is there were a lot of lukewarm Christians growing up. Yeah. And when I say that Christianity was the norm or the expectation and you just assumed everyone was a Christian, I mean that even if people weren't followers of Jesus, they knew who he was and they just said, yeah, I'm a Christian because my family's been a Christian, but they might not be practicing any kind of I can't think of consistence in their faith or
authenticity or
what I will say is we're now on more of a side of hot and cold rather than just like you could call me a Christian. It's either like I am or I'm not. Right. What are you saying?
Oh yeah. Well, that's such a good perspective and I brought this up with a guy who's been a mentor for me most of my life. And I was like, hey, dude, aren't you freaked out that the number of people identifying as Christians in America is going way down? He's like, not even a little bit. I was like, oh, okay, interesting. Why? And what he said is he was like, I think that the number of people who are actually like authentic followers of Jesus is probably the same, but it's just the cultural Christians who are dropping off. You know what I mean? So it's the people who are like, oh, I go to church just because I live in rural Kentucky and
Yeah.
like all my friends are Southern Baptists and we all go to the Southern Baptist church together and it's like our social club. It's like, if Christianity isn't cool anymore, then that's not going to be as like people are just would rather just if they want a social club, they're going to go to the bar or like the gym or whatever.
Uh-huh.
But if it's so if there's really actual persecution happening, it's like, well, yeah, that's going to be a major catalyst for authentic faith. Where I think about in the early Christian church in the Roman Empire, when you would literally get killed or sent to the Colosseum or whatever, it's like there was just such a burning hot fire that was just spreading Christianity like crazy because people were like, oh my gosh, these people are not giving up even when they're being like slaughtered in the Colosseum. Like, what is the deal? Like, something must be different about this. Then, so again, I think as that, if that continues to happen, I think that's going to be more of a thing. And I like your thought that you brought up about growing up in that context. I mean, yeah, I grew up in Colorado Springs, the New Jerusalem, the evangelical Mecca, if you will.
That's what I hear.
Yeah. The amount of nonprofits we have here, I don't know. I think it's like a million. No, I don't know what the number is, but there it brings up a debate of, well, I went to Wheaton College, and there was kind of a debate there where some people would say, oh, Wheaton's a bubble. You've got to pop the bubble because people need to have like actually encounter real life. But then there was some pushback to that of like, well, we're not going to call it a bubble, but we're going to call it a greenhouse.
Wheaton College is a Christian college for those of you who aren't familiar with it.
Yes, Wheaton College, small evangelical Protestant church in Chicago that I went to. But so the response to the bubble comment was, okay, we're not going to call ourselves a bubble, but we're going to call ourselves a greenhouse, where it's like, what's a greenhouse? Controlled conditions that allow for the maximum amount of growth possible, right? Because if you're going to plant yourself, it's kind of the verse where it's like, yeah, some will be planted on the rocks and they're going to get scorched by the sun. Some are going to be planted in the weeds and they're eventually going to get choked out. Some are going to be planted in like a rich, dense soil and they're going to grow 100-fold. And so that was the response where it's like, well, sometimes it is good to create an environment. I think of like the fellows program that you did, Liza, where it's like, okay, that's a greenhouse. I mean, that's an environment where it's just, there's so much, it's a controlled environment where there's just maximum amount of growth possible. And so I think
you're choosing to be in that controlled environment.
Yeah.
It's not like there's these dictators that have forced you to be there. I mean, some people's parents might have made them go, I don't know. But
right.
in your experience, you chose to be there to learn and grow and foster community.
Right.
But that's not to say you're not meant to go out
right.
and be a light in other communities. But
Totally.
I don't think that that's a bad thing
Yeah.
at all to choose that kind of environment.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's maybe the ideal combination is kind of if you have that maybe greenhouse type environment in your home growing up or some other outlet, but then you also are able to go out and kind of grow a resilience in your faith where you actually are encountering the world and you're living and operating and thriving in the world. And I think that's kind of what Paul did, where he just goes out into these pagan cities and he's like, yeah, I want us to go out into the cities and into the, into the marketplace. And so I think there's kind of that ideal combination somewhere in there.
So, back to generations, how would you combat, as a Gen Z or as a millennial, you're millennial, how would you combat older generations saying something along the lines of like, your generation has been babied too much, like you are too, you're almost too, what's the word?
Well, I feel like there's
too exposed to the world. Like you're too exposed to the world. Therefore you've been babied too. And please don't yell at me, First Pres congregation, for my choice of words, because it is not well thought out when I'm speaking organically. However, that's been said to me is, hey, you're sensitive because you have been given all of these options and
Right.
you have been catered to,
Yeah.
whereas like older generations haven't
Right.
necessarily, and that's not,
Yeah.
a statistical fact or anything. It's
For
just
sure.
what I've been told. How do you combat that? And the reverse side of that is, how would you encourage younger generations to absorb the wisdom of the experience of our elders?
Totally. Yeah. And I do think that goes back to the kind of that tension between the different generations where, again, an older guy would look at people in my generation and say, you guys couldn't storm the beaches of Normandy. Like,
Yeah.
I've heard that before, and I'm like, honestly, probably true.
I know I couldn't.
Yeah, it's like that. Yeah. And I mean, you think about it, again, these are that older generation. It's like, these guys are like 18 years old. You know what I mean? And they're like, oh, yeah, I'm just going to wade through the water and run up the hill where these German guys are like shooting machine guns at me. It's like, whoa, okay, that's intense. That's intense. Yeah. And again, it's like there's members here at First Pres who are World War II vets where it's like, I want to learn from those people. Like I want to kind of submit myself to the wisdom of these people who've just lived and experienced so much more than me. But again, I think it does go back to the fact that I think there are some things that the younger generations do well. Like here's another example I thought of. A lot of younger people they'll do something like, you know what, after college, I'm just going to take a gap year and travel or something like that. Where I think sometimes their grandparents might be like, that's a waste of time. You're just delaying adulthood and you're just extending adolescence and all that stuff. Where it's like, well, maybe there's something rational about that, where maybe young people are saying, we've seen sometimes in the older generations, there's just this like work mentality of like, I'm just going to really put all of my personal interests aside and just like be a provider and just where I think younger generations are like, I value experiences more or relationships more or things like that, which I think is fair in some ways too, where it's like, yeah, maybe there is some kind of healthy medium between those two. And but it just creates all these comical type situations at a Thanksgiving where you throw all these people all together, and it's like there's all these, again, there's just these different perspectives. Everybody's getting fed different information through their Google feeds and their algorithms and stuff. So it's like everybody's just pushed more and more extreme. But then it's like when we come together as like actual people face to face, it can be really uncomfortable. But it's like that's what Jesus wanted us to do, right? Recently I've thought about that a lot, where Jesus didn't come down and he's like, okay, I'm going to do these lectures, but then you guys go off on your own and do quiet times. And it's like, no, we're all in this together. We're going to be together for 3 years, guys. We're going to like eat, sleep, walk, everything. Wake up to like sunrise to sunset for 3 years. We're all going to be walking together on the road. We're going to be doing bonfires together. And I mean, they developed all these inside jokes. You can see that like when Jesus comes back, he's just sitting on the shore and he's like, hey, throw the net onto the other side. And then they're like, oh my gosh, like they have these inside jokes. Like I remember when he said that to us a couple of years ago. And then Jesus is like, yeah, come over here and make me some breakfast. Where it's like they have this fun relationship where they've all like lived together. And that's another thing I appreciate about the Fellows program, where it's like, yeah, what's the best way to actually learn and again create that like greenhouse environment? It's with relationship and it's with actual face-to-face encounters. And yeah, I think. And even Floyd invited me on some fellows retreats last year, and the fun thing is there's different fellows who have completely different, maybe political or
for sure.
all these different backgrounds, and but again, it's like, so maybe these people wouldn't naturally choose to just live together for a year, basically.
Well, I can speak to that. Yeah, I think my fellows experience 4 years ago was one of the most formative years of my life. Not only from a spiritual standpoint, but from a community standpoint, because I interacted with people who I would not have been natural friends with, that I still talk to almost every week. And we, aside from our differences, which there were many, we learned to delight in each other. And I think, actually, as we're wrapping up, I think that's what I would encourage our listeners and our viewers to do, is to just delight in one another, learn from one another, and kind of ask yourself, how can I how can I contribute
Mm-hmm.
to a conversation without offense and with just an open mind?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, and I also like the idea of kind of just being able to humble yourself to say any person that I might talk to or interact with, even they could be a completely different generation. There's something I could learn from this person that could convict me and challenge me in my faith and my walk. And I do like your word there of just kind of like delighting in the people that God has put around you, and just living an authentic relationship and seeking to be more like Jesus.
Well, thank you, Parker. That about wraps up our time. And if you're enjoying these conversations on faith and life, please leave a review so that more people can find this podcast. And we'd, of course, love for you to join with us in this conversation. I know we could talk about this for hours and hours. And if there's another topic you'd like for us to discuss, send an email to podcast@firstprescos.org. And if you're watching the video version on YouTube, as always, leave a comment below. And we'll look forward to seeing you in our next episode when we talk with Ashley Anderson, our Youth Ministries Director. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.